Hello? All right, I'm on. All right, hello. My name is Isaac Woodward, and I'm the president of Ratio Christi at Rutgers. I would like to thank, first of all, Rutgers University for giving us the opportunity to host an event like this. Ratio Christi is a student Christian apologetics group that equips university students and faculty to give historical, philosophical, and scientific reasons for following Jesus Christ. We have weekly meetings where we wrestle with ideas relating to the intellectual credibility of Christianity by encouraging dialogue and stimulating discussion. Everyone is welcome to attend, engage in the conversation, and ask questions that they are concerned about in a friendly environment. You can check out our free material over on the tables at the back. Ratio Christi at Rutgers meets weekly on Monday nights at 9 p.m. in the Rutgers Student Center Atrium Conference Room. All right, next we would like to acknowledge our sponsors for Ethics Week. The Chuck Colson Center for Christian Worldview, which you just saw the video from, is committed to building and resourcing a movement of people living and defending the Christian worldview. Through websites, online news, and radio programs, the Colson Center applies solid thinking to the key ideas of the day. Find out more at colsoncenter.org. Alliance Defending Freedom is an organization working to keep the door open for religious freedom by transforming the legal system and advocating for religious liberty, the sanctity of life, and marriage in the family. Find more about them at alliancedefendingfreedom.org. Also, ISI we would like to acknowledge for the support of this meeting here. The Intercollegiate Studies Institute works to instill an understanding and appreciation of America's founding principles. They host seminars, publish several journals and magazines, all in the service of educating the next generation in the principles of liberty. Some of you on your chairs will see cards that you can fill out about ISI. If you then take that to the table outside in the back at the end, you can get a chance to win one of the books that they're raffling away. Also, the table for Ryan Anderson and Kellie is over on the side where you can get information about the Heritage Foundation. All right, now on to our topic. Why is ethics so important? Nearly every major discipline will interact with ethics, the branch of philosophy dealing with right and wrong behavior. Whether it concerns religion, behavior, science, business, and work life, family life, or medicine, these subjects cannot be isolated from ethics. However, in today's world, we have arrived at a period where with a disharmony of voices, each claiming their own truth. We will be addressing topics like abortion, marriage, moral relativism, reproduction, end-of-life care, and family. These topics are all intertwined in everyone's daily lives. Doing the Right Thing is a nationwide initiative to explore these issues at the Academy. However, what if we were not even allowed or encouraged to discuss these controversial topics? In order to have a culture where everyone has a voice, we must also acknowledge the importance of our right to dissent. Specifically, as college students, you need to understand that the First Amendment of the United States Constitution protects your right to a robust and vital public dialogue. The Constitution protects the right of speech, association, and access for all students, faculty, and staff on public university campuses. The Free to Disagree corollary to Ethics Week encourages you to exercise your rights on campus and make sure that your voice is heard. The message you share and your unique perspective will strengthen the collegiate experience for everyone. Now on to our specific topic for this evening, sexuality and marriage. Please take a look at the printed program you were given as you came in and note the questions on the back panel. Throughout the event, please take a few minutes to fill out the questionnaire. At the end of the evening, you'll be asked to turn this in at the end. Also, don't forget to hand in the cards to take to the back table for the ISI book that you might be able to win. Now on to our speakers. It is my privilege to introduce the speakers for this evening, Ryan T. Anderson and Kellie Fiedorek. Ryan T. Anderson researches and writes about marriage and religious liberty as the William E. Simon Fellow in Religion and a Free Society at the Heritage Foundation. Anderson is the editor of Public Discourse, the online journal of the Witherspoon Institute of Princeton, New Jersey. He is the co-author with Princeton's Robert P. George and Sharif Gurges of What is Marriage? Man, Woman, a Defense, a book that was cited in the recent Supreme Court decision regarding marriage. Kellie Fiedorek has experience in constitutional law and federal issues related to life, marriage, and religious freedom. She serves as a litigation counsel with the Alliance Defending Freedom at its Washington, D.C. Regional Service Center, where she is an invaluable member of the Center for Marriage and Family. Everyone, please welcome our first speaker, Ryan Anderson.
Great, thank you. Thank you for coming. I'm going to take just a couple minutes. The title of this is, What Does Ethics Have to Do with It? So I'm going to talk about marriage and sexuality primarily under the guise of social justice as the primary ethical category that has to do with it. I'm going to talk about marriage, what it is, why it matters for a political community, why it matters that civil society get marriage right. And then I'll close by saying a few things about what ethics has to do with it as personal morality, virtue, and those sorts of things. We're going to start with a public argument about marriage under the guise of social justice and then transition into personal morality. But first, a word about what I'm not going to say today. I'm not going to speak about theology tonight. I'm not going to speak about tradition. I'm not going to make an argument from tradition. There are some people who make an argument about marriage that because this is how marriage has been, this is the way it ought to be. That won't be my argument. And I'm not going to say anything about homosexuality. You can be in favor or not in favor of homosexuality and still have to answer the question of what is marriage. In fact, I think that's probably the foundational question. The opponents, or the proponents of redefining marriage have a nice slogan. Their slogan is marriage equality. And they refuse to answer the question that I think is actually foundational, the question that's prior to anything about equality, which is definitional, the question, what is marriage? I like to say that everyone in this debate is for marriage equality. We all want the law and civil society to treat all marriages in the same way. We want the law to treat marriage equally. But that doesn't yet tell us what is the institution of marriage and what makes a marital relationship different from other relationships. Every marriage policy will draw a line between what is a marriage and relationships that aren't marriages. The question for equality is what lines ought to be drawn. Only if we know what marriage is can we know if the lines that we're drawing are treating marriages equally or not, if they're treating them justly or not. The best view of marriage, the best case for marriage that we've seen that includes same-sex relationships as marriages understands marriage as something like an intense emotional relationship. It sees marriage as the most important or the most intense romantic interpersonal relationship that one might form. It involves caregiving, it involves support. It's not clear to me on this vision of marriage why the state's in the marriage business, or why marriage has the characteristics that has traditionally been associated with marriage. So my co-authors and I just think that this vision of marriage just simply gets marriage wrong. What it's describing is companionship. It's not describing a marital relationship. One philosopher that we quote in our book and who we've discussed with in various fora, John Corvino, calls marriage, establishes your relationship with what he calls your number one person. That's the marital relationship. It's your number one person. The question for us is, why is it your number one rather than your number 1 and 2 or 3 and 4? Why is it supposed to be a permanent relationship? Why is it supposed to be an exclusive relationship? That is, the 3 hallmarks of marriage in American law have been marriage as a monogamous relationship, marriage as a sexually exclusive relationship, and marriage as a permanent relationship. But if marriage is primarily about romance and an intense emotional relationship and about mutual caregiving and support, it's not clear why that can only take place between 2 people. It seems that 3 or 4 or more people can have intense emotional regard for each other, can have romantic feelings for each other, can pledge to take care of each other. And so there seems to be no reason in principle why the law would recognize the marital relationship as something that's between only 2 consenting adults. Likewise, there seems to be no reason why marriage would call for exclusivity, and in particular, sexual exclusivity. Some relationships might be enhanced by only having sexual relations inside of the marriage with the spouses. Other relationships, if they're consensual and if there's no deceit, there's no lying, there's no coercion, could be enhanced if marriage is an intense emotional union by having sexual relations outside of marriage. So it's not clear on the view that marriage is an intense emotional relationship why sexual relations ought to be reserved for marriage. And then lastly, it's not clear why this view gets marriage right if marriage is supposed to be a permanent relationship, because intense emotional relationships can come and go. They can wax and they can wane, and why can't you have a temporary intense emotional relationship? Who says that because you're having a romantic connection with a person today that you ought to retain that romantic connection 10 years from now, or 20 years from now, or even just a day from now. So it's not clear how, in this vision of marriage, marriage should either be a monogamous institution, or a permanent institution, or a sexually exclusive institution. And for that matter, it's not clear why government would be in the marriage business at all. If marriage is just about the consenting love lives of adults, why don't we just get the government out of the marriage business? It seems that we don't need to have government in the bedroom if it's just about the love and tender feelings and care of adults. We can do that without having government regulation. So it seems to my co-authors and I that just gets marriage wrong. And so during the Q&A, if you disagree with us, it would be wonderful to entertain questions as to why this view gets marriage right, or if there's a superior view of what marriage is that would include same-sex relationships and explain why marriage ought to be a monogamous, permanent, and sexually exclusive relationship. We've put this challenge to our critics and to various other authors, and we've yet to find a persuasive response. So hopefully we can have that tonight. So if that's what marriage isn't, what is marriage? My co-authors and I argue that what sets marriage apart from other relationships is that it's a comprehensive union, and that this is what makes marriage different than other forms of companionship, and what makes marriage different from friendship in general, and what makes marriage different than something like an academic community or a sports team. And I mention those because those will be the examples that I'll refer to by comparison. The analysis that we give for marriage, what marriage is and why it matters, flows from a generally Aristotelian account. And you can analyze any sort of community, any form of association by looking at the action that the members of the community engage in, the goods that the members of the community pursue, and then the norms or the commitments that the members of the community live by. And so to give an example, think of a university community, think of Rutgers. It's an academic community, and so you engage in academic action. Those are the types of action that make you a distinctively academic community, that make you a university. You attend lectures and your professors deliver lectures. You read books, your professors write books. You take tests, your professor grades tests. You go to office hours and you discuss the topics of the lectures and of your upcoming term papers and of the final exam. All of these actions are what make an academic community distinctively academic. What are these actions aimed at? They're aimed at the pursuit of truth. What you're trying to do here is not just engage in propaganda, indoctrination. You're not just trying to justify whatever opinions you happen to hold just because they're yours, but you're trying to shed away your false opinions. You're trying to get rid of ignorance and acquire truth, and then appropriate that truth into your lives, into your character, so that you can live out the truth. Those are the goods that an academic community is pursuing. So then what are the norms, the types of commitments that an academic community lives by? Things like academic integrity and honesty. You don't plagiarize your papers. You cite all of your sources. If you're a researcher that uses data, you cite all of the data, even the data that might cut against your hypothesis, so that other scholars can replicate your experiments, can check your footnotes and see if your sources actually say what you claim they say. Because this actually helps the academic process discover the truth. If you write a paper, you want your professor to check out your footnotes and say, wait, I think you're quoting this out of context. That's not what the author meant there. Or you want another scholar to come by and examine your data and say, wait, I think you made a mistake in analyzing the data. Because what your whole enterprise is oriented towards is knowledge of the truth. And so you have actions that pursue the truth, and you have norms that govern that pursuit. So we say the same analysis can be used to investigate what a marital relationship is and what separates and distinguishes a marital relationship from other types of human relationship. And we argue that marriage is comprehensive in those three exact ways. It's comprehensive in the acts that spouses engage in, it's comprehensive in the goods that spouses pursue, and it's comprehensive in the norms of commitment that it demands of spouses in order to be a marriage. What do I mean by that? Marriage is comprehensive in that it unites us at all levels of our personhood. It unites us at hearts and minds, but it also unites us as bodily beings. It unites us towards a comprehensive good, not the good of any particular individuals or any particular aspect of goodness. So it's not just orient us towards the good of truth or the good of winning a football game or the good of beauty or art, but it's orienting us towards the whole array of human goods because it's orienting us towards creating new life and then raising that new life to flourish as an individual who can appreciate all forms of human goodness. And then lastly, it demands a comprehensive commitment of us, a comprehensive commitment throughout time, so permanency, and a comprehensive commitment at each and every time, so exclusivity, forsaking all others. And the type of exclusivity that it calls for is sexual exclusivity, precisely because it's the sexual act that unites spouses in this comprehensive way. So that was a mouthful. I don't expect you to pick that up on the first go through, so I'm going to unpack each step of that argument right now. The first thing, the comprehensive action. Because we're bodily beings, we're not just ghosts and machines, we're not just spirits, we're not just intellects. To unite comprehensively with another person requires that you unite at every level of your personhood. Ordinary friendships don't require that. Those are friendships of hearts and minds. You don't unite bodily with your ordinary friends. Likewise, an academic community is a union of hearts and minds. You're pursuing the truth, but you don't engage in bodily union. The marital relationship does that because it extends a union of hearts and minds into this bodily domain precisely to unite in this comprehensive way. How can two people unite bodily? How can they unite comprehensively? The answer to that question requires us thinking about what is it that makes any given body one body? What is it that makes my body a single organism? What is it that makes my various organs, my heart and my lungs, my muscles, my bones, my skin, all of these various parts, one body, rather than just a disaggregate heap of cells? I'm not just a clump of cells. So what is it that makes me a unity? It's that all these various organs, all these various systems are actively coordinating with each other for the common good of my biological life. They're organizing themselves in a way that sustains my bodily being. My co-authors and I argue that in the same way, in the conjugal act, a man and a woman unite comprehensively so that their bodies unite towards a common good of the two of them, a common good of the mated pair. With respect to all biological functions but one, human beings are complete. Digestion, locomotion, these are things that I do on my own. But when it comes to reproduction, we're radically incomplete. It requires a man and a woman in the conjugal act to unite to pursue one biological end, the reproduction of the species, but it's that mated pair. So that in conjugal action, a man and a woman, a husband and a wife, truly form one flesh. The phrase that the Hebrew scriptures use isn't just metaphorical. It's not just poetic. It's not just a nice, lofty ideal. It's a reality. A man and a woman in a conjugal act truly do become one flesh. They form a two-in-one flesh union that extends a union of hearts and minds into this bodily dimension. So in the same way that when we discussed the academic community, I said we engage in various academic action, and what is it oriented towards? It's oriented towards the discovery and appropriation of the truth. We can consider what is the conjugal act, the marital act, what is that naturally oriented towards? And it's oriented towards the creation of new life and the bearing and rearing of that new life. It's the same act that unites a husband and a wife in this comprehensive way that also unites them towards the creation of a new child, and then demands of them that they raise that child to maturity so that that child then can flourish in all the various aspects of human goodness. Not just this or that aspect of human goodness, not just to become well-educated or to become a good athlete, but to flourish in all of the ways that we can flourish. And so in that way, it's a comprehensive good that the spouses are pursuing. And the actions that they perform tell us something about the good that that type of relationship is naturally oriented to. So then lastly, it calls for a comprehensive commitment both throughout time, meaning that if you're going to pledge yourself to another person in this interpersonal union, it's for keeps, it's for life. You can't unite comprehensively with another person if you hold something back. And then likewise, it demands that you forsake all others. It demands exclusivity. But the type of exclusivity that it demands is sexual exclusivity. You don't cheat on your spouse if you discuss chemistry with someone other than your spouse. You don't cheat on your spouse if you play tennis with someone other than your spouse. So those aren't the distinctive activities of marriage. You do cheat on your spouse if you sleep with someone other than your spouse, because it's sex that unites us in this bodily way with another person, and so changes a union that was just a union of hearts and minds into this comprehensive union. And so in that sense, you could think that sleeping with another person is akin to plagiarizing your term paper. It frustrates the precise goal of the union. If the goal of the union is to pursue truth and you're plagiarizing your work, then it's not your work. You're misrepresenting, you're being untruthful right from the get-go. And if you unite with someone else bodily, then you're not comprehensively uniting with your spouse, because the action that's distinctive of that relationship isn't being reserved and utilized to embody, express, and realize the marital bond. The basic sketch that I just gave, and that we go into much more detail in the book, is something that we find expressed in the ancient Romans and Greeks. Thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, Musonius Rufus and Plutarch all suggest that a vision like this. We see it in the canon law of the church, but also the common law in the English tradition and the civil law of the American tradition. We see it in Enlightenment thinkers like Locke and Kant. We see it in Eastern thinkers like Gandhi. What we think this suggests is that this vision of marriage isn't the particular province of any given theological or philosophical or political community, but it's grounded in human nature. There's something about human beings as created male and female, with the sexual differentiation between a man and a woman, and what that allows is a possibility for comprehensive union, for the bearing and rearing of children, that has many different political, theological, and philosophical communities identifying this crux of a human good. None of them articulate it in quite the way that my co-authors and I articulate it. None of them have all the precise contours that we lay out, but they all have something approaching this conception of marriage. And so for us, that demands an explanation. When you see this sort of a universal human experience up until the year 2000, it calls for an explanation. And this is the philosophical explanation that we've given for it. But that said, you can say, all right, maybe that's what marriage is. What does ethics have to do with that? What does social justice have to do with that? What does the state have to do with that? So now I want to pivot to answer that question. Social justice is primarily about promoting the common good. And for a political community, it's particularly important to protect the weak, the marginalized, the oppressed, and to give the least among us the best chance of a flourishing life. That's what ethics demands of a political community. That's why government's in the marriage business. Government's in the marriage business to protect the rights and the needs of children, to maximize the likelihood that they will be raised by the man and the woman who gave them life. So we argue that from the state's perspective, marriage exists to unite a man and a woman as husband and wife, to be mother and father to any children that their union creates. It's based on the truth that men and women are sexually complementary, that reproduction requires a man and a woman, and that children deserve a mom and a dad. Part of this is based on a biological fact that whenever a child is born, a mother will be close by. That's simply a fact of biology. The question for culture is, will a father be close by? And if so, for how long? And the law in this case can help support that culture by promoting the truth about marriage, or the law can help destroy that culture by promoting a falsehood. What we know from the social science, including research from your own David Popenoe in the sociology department, is that there's no such thing as parenting in the abstract. There's mothering and there's fathering. That men and women bring different gifts to the parenting enterprise, and that children do best when they have both a mother and a father. Popenoe writes, quote, "The burden of social science evidence support the idea that gender-differentiated parenting is important for human development, and that the contribution of fathers to child-rearing is unique and irreplaceable." He then concludes, quote, "We should disavow the notion that mommies can make good daddies, just as we should disavow the popular notion that daddies can make good mommies. The two sexes are different to the core, and each is necessary, culturally and biologically, for the optimal development of a human being." End quote. We then cite a host of social science in both the book and in various papers that I've written for the Heritage Foundation that just go through all of the various statistics on why marriage between a mother and a father, preferably biological mother and a father, really does matter for a child, which can explain why the government's in the marriage business. It's not because it cares about my love life. The government's not in the marriage business because it cares about the butterfly feelings that someone gets when they fall in love. That's all that marriage is. The state can get out of the bedroom. No, the state's in the marriage business because marriage is a personal relationship that really serves the common good. It's a personal relationship with public significance. It's the least restrictive way any political community can ensure the well-being of future citizens. Because either the man and the woman who create that child take responsibility for raising that child, or some third party is going to have to take responsibility for that child, frequently at the expense of the broader community and at the expense of the child, him or herself. So what we know from the social science, I'll read a quote from President Obama. Quote, "We know the statistics that children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of schools, and 20 times more likely to end up in prison. They're more likely to have behavioral problems or run away from home or become teenage parents themselves. And the foundations of our community are weaker because of it. Fathers matter, and marriage helps connect fathers to mothers, and then that man and that woman, that mother and that father, to children." What we saw during the 70s and the 80s as the marriage culture began to fall apart in America, that this is when child poverty rose, this is when crime increased, it's when social mobility decreased, it's when the prison population increased, it's when the welfare state exploded. So everything that you could care about, if you care about both social justice and limited government, if you care about both the poor and you care about freedom, are better served by a healthy marriage culture than by a debased marriage culture, where government then tries to pick up the pieces of a breakdown in civil society. So that said, I'll say 3 things as to the likely consequences of the redefinition of marriage, and then I'll close with a word about ethics in an additional sense. The vision of marriage that I painted at the beginning as an intense emotional union is something that informs many relationships, both heterosexual and homosexual. There's nothing distinctively gay about that vision of marriage. It's true that it can include same-sex relationship under some umbrella, but it's not something that's distinctively the province of just same-sex relationships. So the question in law for redefining marriage in civil society is, will it replace this comprehensive union view of what marriage is and why it matters with a vision of marriage that's based much more on adult romantic and emotional desire? My co-authors and I argue that it will. That's precisely what will happen. It won't be increasing the category of who's eligible for marriage. It'll be abolishing one conception of what marriage is and replacing it with another conception. And one of the things that the law will then do is it will teach that this is what marriage is, and these are the demands that it requires of spouses. So the first consequence that we highlight is that it will eliminate from law any institution that even upholds as an ideal that children deserve a mother and a father, that men and women are distinct, that they're not interchangeable, and that not only do children deserve a mother and a father, but they deserve a married mother and father. It's very hard for the law to teach that fathers are essential in the way that President Obama discussed in that quote that I read, when the law redefines marriage to make fathers optional. How does a law simultaneously say fathers really matter when it also says that 2 mothers are the same thing as a mother and a father? Or that 2 mothers or 2 fathers are the same thing as a mother and a father? It's hard for the law to be doing double duty there. And there won't be an institution that really upholds the needs of children over the desires of adults. The redefinition of marriage so that it's an intense emotional relationship makes it much more about adults than about children. And the only reason government's in the marriage business is to protect the needs and the rights of children. So that's the first consequence, is how it will shape the public understanding of what marriage is. The second consequence is that the redefinition of marriage wouldn't stop just with the sexual complementarity aspect. If you argue that the union of a man and a woman is irrational and arbitrary, to view marriage as something that's intrinsically conjugally based between a man and a woman, where sexual complementarity goes to the heart of what marriage is, what principle is left for why marriage should be something that's monogamous or exclusive or permanent? So at the beginning I said this is a challenge for that other vision of marriage that they don't seem to be able to answer. It then becomes a challenge for our law, for if we do redefine marriage to say that it's arbitrary and irrational, to say that it's a male-female relationship, what do you say if you're the Supreme Court justice who hears the case of the same-sex throuple? A throuple is a 3-person couple. And so when they come to your court and they say, your marriage laws are violating our marriage equality rights. They're not treating our marriage equally. We have a 3-person marriage. We want the same sorts of recognition and benefits and social approval as the same-sex couple. What will your response be? What principle will there be that limits marriage to a 2-person relationship once you say that male-female unions aren't anything special? Because the reason that we arrived at monogamy in American marriage law is that it was one man and one woman who can unite in this sort of action that produces new life, and every child has exactly one mother and one father. Other than that, there's nothing magical about the number 2. There's nothing particularly principled or special about monogamy apart from the type of union that it allows for between conjugally, sexually complementary spouses. So that's one new word, the throuple. We discovered that word in New York Magazine back when we were doing research for the book. Another word that we discovered was wed-lease. A wed-lease is a play on the term wedlock. Wedlock connotes something that's permanent and stable and sturdy. Locks are important. A wed-lease implies something that's temporary and transient. You can lease a car, you can lease a house. Why not lease a bride? This was the argument that was made in the Washington Post earlier this year by an attorney who was saying that the problem with marriage in America is that we have unrealistic expectations. We expect it to last forever, but we can't pledge to love and care for one other person for the entirety of life. We should reform marriage law to make it a temporary license that can be renewed on good behavior. So if after 5 years things aren't working out, you just walk away because you only had a 5-year marriage contract from the beginning. No harm, no foul, no hard feelings. But if it's going well, you can renew it for another 5-year term. This sort of an idea. And then the last new term that we came across was from a New York Times profile of Dan Savage, and this is the term monogamish. A monogamish relationship is a play on the word monogamous. And so it's a 2-person relationship, but it's sexually open. So this argument is that marriage is an intense emotional romantic bond, but sometimes that union can actually be enhanced by having sexual relationships outside of marriage. That again, we're not being realistic, and part of the problem of American marriage law is that it places this unrealistic expectation on spouses to only sleep with each other for the rest of their lives. But sometimes you need to spice things up in the bedroom, and that requires having these extramarital outlets. And again, provided there's no coercion and there's no deceit, what's wrong with it? Now, whatever the ethics are of 3-person or 4-person marriages, or temporary marriages, or sexually open marriages, think about what the public policy consequences would be. Think about what the social justice consequences would be. Again, the reason the state's in the marriage business is to ensure that every child that's conceived has a relationship with the man and the woman who created that child. But for every additional sexual partner I have, and for every short-lived sexual relationship that I have, the greater the likelihood that I create fragmented families and fatherless children. For every additional woman I sleep with, there's a greater chance that our union produces a child, and then my attention, my money, my resources, my love, and my care are then divided across those families, between those women, between those children. So how will the law teach that men and women should commit to each other permanently and exclusively to then be mothers and fathers to the children they create, when we've redefined marriage to make it about the consenting love lives of adults in whatever sizes or shapes consenting love comes in? So that's the second consequence. The last consequence has to deal with religious liberty, and we have a wonderful religious liberty attorney here who will focus on that. So I'll just say a brief word about that, and then Kellie will go into more detail there. But we've already seen examples in Massachusetts, in Washington, D.C., and in Illinois, where the government has shut down Catholic charities that were running adoption agencies. And this had nothing to do with funding, it just had to do with licensing. It's illegal to run an adoption agency if you don't have an adoption license. And the government said, unless you place children with same-sex couples on an equal basis as you do with married mothers and fathers, we won't give you a marriage license because you're not treating these couples equally, you're discriminating. The institutions argued we have social science that show that men and women parent in different ways, that children do best with moms and dads, and we have this thing called the First Amendment. But in all 3 jurisdictions, the government wouldn't give them an adoption agency license, and they were forced to close their doors, which does nothing to help the orphans. So again, there's a social justice violation here. Children are not served by having fewer adoption and foster care services. But we've also seen bakers and innkeepers and photographers and florists and a whole host of cases that Kellie will talk about of how the law has discriminated against, coercing people of faith who couldn't in good conscience lend their artistic services to a same-sex ceremony. So that said, I just want to say a word about what else ethics has to do with it, the title of tonight's presentation. The only way we arrived at a cultural and political moment at which the concept of redefining marriage to eliminate the expectation of sexual complementarity, so as to include same-sex relationships, was a live possibility, was a result of a host of unethical sexual behavior on the part of heterosexuals. During the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, including right down to this very moment, heterosexuals bought into a liberal ideology about sex that more or less said if it feels good, do it, and that if it's consensual, then it's ethical. And you saw this in things like the rise in pornography and the hookup culture, the rise in premarital sex and adultery, the rise in divorce. A whole bunch of activities that put the desires of adults over the needs of children, and that more or less made a mockery of the institution of marriage. The virtue that governs, that promotes the good of marriage. So if the first part of this talk was really about a false vision of what marriage is and then an alternative, true vision of what marriage is, there's a virtue that helps prepare us to live out the truth about marriage, the virtue of chastity. So what ethics has to do with it is helping individuals prepare themselves in their sexual behavior to live out the truth about marriage. If it's the sexual act, a conjugal union, that allows for a marriage to be consummated, to be expressed, realized, and actualized, and renewed, to embody that relationship, then there are a host of ways in which our own sexual behavior can either detract from that or promote that. And whether it's college hookups, or pornography in the dorm rooms, or premarital sex, or affairs with coworkers, or divorce for trivial reasons, there are a whole host of ways in which Americans have debased the truth about marriage by failing to live it out in their own lives. So then you arrive at a point where if we already don't have marriages that are permanent, we redefined marriage 40 years ago with no-fault divorce. Marriage used to have an expectation, a strong expectation of permanency in law. In common law, it was the 3 A's that gave you grounds for divorce: abuse, abandonment, and adultery. And you would file for a divorce and you would cite the reason why. Your spouse abused you, your spouse abandoned you, your spouse committed adultery. With the introduction of no-fault divorce laws, you could now divorce your spouse for any reason or for no reason at all. So you could more or less walk away from your marriage contract in ways that are easier than walking away from a contract with a painter or a roofer. So it made it something that had an expectation of, well, permanency is nice if it's for you, but it can also be temporary. And we saw the divorce rates change as a result. We saw divorce rates that were once in single digits rise to nearly 50%. And what that shows us is that the law functions as a teacher. But once we weakened one norm of marriage, the permanency norm, and then we weakened the exclusivity norm because there was more and more premarital and extramarital sex, it's not surprising that another norm of marriage, sexual complementarity, is the one that's being challenged today. So what that really demands of us, with what's ethics have to do with it, is a commitment to live out the truth about marriage in our own lives. Rational arguments, philosophical arguments do so much good, but the lived reality of marriage, it's the lives of the saints that ultimately persuade people about the truth of a certain course of action. So what it really demands is each one of us living out the virtue of chastity.
Please join me now in welcoming Kellie Fiedorek to the stage. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Isaac, and thanks to everyone for coming out tonight and for being here. Part of my job that I love the most is being able to come and to speak, especially with students. And so it's exciting and it's inspiring to see that all of you are here tonight. And we truly live in a really challenging time. There are a lot of messages out there about love, about happiness, and about marriage. And many of you might wonder if it really matters. Maybe some of you think it's a good thing to redefine marriage. You might be on a whole wide array of where you come down on this issue. But the fact that you're here tonight shows me that you're engaged and that you care to learn about the arguments about marriage and what marriage is and why it matters. And I hope that by the end of tonight, you will have at least a better understanding of what it is. And perhaps you'll even leave here with more excitement and conviction to defend this important institution that matters so much to our families, to children, and to society as a whole. And so, as Ryan was saying, there's many factors that have contributed to the breakdown of marriage and why it's become a weakened institution. Most of us here tonight have experienced either ourselves personally or we've witnessed friends who have gone through divorce or whose parents have been divorced. We've seen and lived firsthand that pain. We've also witnessed what infidelity can do to marriage. We know people or perhaps have experienced becoming pregnant outside of marriage and having to face the choices that come when that happens. So we all recognize and have lived out what some of the downfall and the weakening of marriage means. And all of these situations, as Ryan was articulating, have really contributed to the breakdown of what I like to call the marriage culture in our country and really in society at large. And there's no denying that there's been a fundamental shift in our perspective. Marriage was once seen more as self-gift, giving of love to another. And it's shifted now into more of what's in this for me, an emotional intensity, a personal satisfaction. And this is a truly dangerous place when it comes to marriage, because if it's really all about emotional intensity or what's in it for me or is this making me happy, well then, if you're not happy, well then you would leave. So this is another way marriage has been weakened. And then you have the effort to redefine marriage entirely. And what has been part of society for centuries, which is the union of one man and one woman coming together, when you have this effort to break that down and change it, it has significant implications. And while some people might argue that allowing same-sex marriage might actually strengthen marriage, the reality is that when you redefine marriage as something other than a man and woman, it has significant implications, and it actually will weaken marriage further. And we're just now embarking on sort of this social experiment of allowing same-sex couples to marry. So we don't yet know all of the implications, but there are definitely some of them which we're going to talk about today. And a great example is if you think about a picture. You have this beautiful picture in an art gallery, but over time, this picture the colors have faded. There's probably a crack in the glass. Cobwebs have gathered on the picture. So what are you going to do to strengthen that? Are you going to dust up the cobwebs and strengthen the institution, or are you going to allow the dust to gather further and allow the picture to fade even more? And with marriage, it's the same thing. We need to engage on this issue and understand what marriage is and why it matters in order to restore a marriage culture. And as Ryan was explaining, marriage is the very bedrock of our society. And it's a relationship unlike any other because marriage is the only relationship. One man and one woman are the only two people who can come together to create new life. And it's also based on the reality that children do best with both a mom and a dad. So clearly, marriage needs to be strengthened. But how do we go about defending it? How do we go about rebuilding this institution? Tonight, I want to give you a starting point, something to at least think about in terms of this question. So I want to briefly start by talking about the Supreme Court's recent marriage decisions this past June, just as sort of a general overview to discuss what they said. Then I want to talk a little bit about why the government cares about the marriage relationship in the first place. I want to talk about a little bit about the consequences of redefining marriage and the implications that that has for our First Amendment freedoms and for society at large. And then lastly, I just want to propose some concrete steps for all of you in terms of engaging and considering this issue more deeply. So where are we? As many of you know, the Supreme Court at the end of June came down with 2 marriage decisions. And they were considering, in one case, a state marriage law that defined marriage as one man and one woman. And in the other case, they were considering a provision of a statute that defined, for purposes of federal law, that marriage is one man and one woman. And really, the court struck down in the federal case, in the Windsor decision, it struck down Section 3 of the Defense of Marriage Act. And it basically said, look, federal government, Congress, you guys went too far. Marriage is supposed to be left to the realms of the state. It's the state's right to define laws about marriage. And so when you define marriage between one man and one woman, you usurped the role of the state, and you can't do that. With Prop 8, which was the state law, the constitutional amendment in California, essentially what the court did was leave that in significant legal limbo. And so there's a lot of questions on really what exactly is the state of the law in California. But really, for our purposes today, there's 2 important points to take from these 2 decisions. One is that the Supreme Court said nothing, in both cases, said nothing good or bad about same-sex marriage. They did not find a constitutional right to same-sex marriage. And this is significant because when the proponents of redefining marriage set out, their goal, their end game, was to redefine marriage for the entire country and to impose a new definition of marriage on the whole country, and which is one that would find a constitutional right to same-sex marriage. And the court didn't do this. The court refused to do that, in fact. And they also refused to find that same-sex marriage is a civil rights issue. So that's the first point to take home, is that there was no right found by the Supreme Court that there's a right to same-sex marriage. Secondly, the way in which the Defense of Marriage Act was struck down poses significant dangers to our First Amendment freedoms. Our ability to speak freely or refrain from speaking on these important issues, as well as our ability to speak according to our convictions, to live our lives according to these beliefs. All of these were called into question. And that's because Justice Kennedy, in his decision when he came down, he basically said that there was no rational reason that Congress or President Bill Clinton in 1996, there was no rational reason that they could have defined marriage as between one man and one woman. He said that the only motivating factor that could have propelled them was they must have had bias towards same-sex couples, and they must have been motivated by hate or animus. Now that's a really, really significant statement to make, regardless of your position on same-sex marriage. Because if you think about it, what is this saying? This is saying that significant majorities in both the House of Representatives and the United States Senate and President Bill Clinton, the only reason that they decided to pass a law in 1996 was motivated by a distaste or a hatred even. He said they were enemies of the human race to define marriage in this way. And that ignores centuries and centuries of how society has defined marriage from the very, very beginning of time. It also ignores the fact that every state in the Union had defined it, and really same-sex marriage had not really even been considered really up until around that point in time. So to say that all of these different individuals didn't have any rational reason, they didn't have a reason for that perhaps marriage is good for society because it brings a husband and wife together, it helps the law to encourage them to stay faithful to one another, it encourages them to be moms and dads to their kids, marriage is good for children, it ignored social science evidence. None of these reasons the court found. So this has significant implications and wrongly implies that those who believe marriage is a good thing, that bringing men and women together in that relationship is a good thing, it wrongly implies that they're motivated by some sort of dislike for same-sex couples, which is most certainly not the case. Everyone is free to love whom they choose, and the government is not required to change its definition of marriage just because it doesn't have an interest in certain kinds of relationships. So stepping back a minute, I wanted to re-highlight what Ryan was talking about what marriage is. Marriage brings a man and a woman together as husband and wife in a committed relationship to then be father and mother to any children that they might have. And to change the meaning of marriage from a gendered definition to a genderless relationship would undermine, if not change entirely, the very fabric of the society which we live. Now, you might think that same-sex marriage is a good thing, but I would at least encourage you as we talk and we dialogue tonight that there are a lot of unintended consequences that perhaps you haven't seen about what it looks like for a society where no longer is the norm to have a mom and a dad, to have men and women coming together to create children and to ensure that civilization continues. So why does the government care about marriage? This is always an interesting point for me, so let's think about this for a second. The government doesn't come in and care about my relationship with my best friend. They don't care about my relationship with my boyfriend. They don't care about your guys' relationships with your siblings, with your classmates. The government really doesn't have much interest in most types of relationships. But it takes a lot of interest, and it historically has taken a lot of interest in the marriage relationship. So why is this? Why does it care about marriage and really not care about even other very loving, very committed types of relationships? Well, it has a unique interest in marriage because it sees the marital relationship as benefiting society in a way that no other relationship can. It sees marriage as bringing a man and woman together to commit to each other, and it also sees in that relationship the best environment for which children can be brought into. And history also reveals to us that when men and women are in these types of relationships, it bodes best for society both fiscally and socially. But I really want to stress for just a minute the procreative aspect of why the government has an interest in marriage. Because men and women, as I said earlier, that relationship, they're the only ones who can bring forth new life. It's biologically, physically impossible for two women to produce children or for two men to produce children. And marriage furthers then every child's natural desire to know, where he came from and who his parents are and who his grandparents are. And so I think it's important to think about this from this angle. The government wants to make sure that children, as much as possible, can be raised by a mom and a dad. And I recognize that there are obviously situations where this doesn't happen. We have heroic single moms and single dads out there who have done terrific jobs raising their children. So I'm not talking about these situations. I'm talking about the government and what the government should put forth as what's ideal, what's best. What should the government encourage families to do wherever possible? And I think, I don't know how many of you watch the show Modern Family, but I find the show interesting. And I noticed an episode a couple weeks ago, maybe you all have seen it, and it basically showed, the two gay dads, the two of their little girl. They adopted her from Vietnam. And they decided she was asking some questions, and she really needed to have a mother figure. She needed to have a mom. So they arranged for her to have a date with her aunt. And so the aunt came over to take the little girl on a girl's date, because the reality that the show was revealing was that something was lacking in that relationship. And while those two dads obviously loved their daughter, they're in the show, obviously they're trying to provide a wonderful, nurturing environment for her, there was something missing. There was something missing because she didn't have a female role model as a mother in her life. And I don't know, you'll recall there was another episode where the young girl was wondering who her mother was, and she was asking her dads, and they didn't really want to tell her, and then they told her she was a princess from some other country. But the point is this little girl wanted to have a relationship with her mother. She wanted to know who she was. And this is something that's natural. It's innate in all of us that we desire to know where we came from, and wherever possible to know who our mom is and who our dad is. So the government sees marriage and that relationship and wants to support and encourage that to ensure and guarantee that children's needs are placed over the desires of other people, of other adults. So when we redefine marriage, we then tell children that we chose for you not to be able to ever know your mom, or we chose that it was better for you not to ever know your dad. It also places, as Ryan was saying, a new idea into the law, that marriage is whatever emotional bond the government wants it to be, instead of focus on the needs of children and family and then society at large. It also, redefining marriage, pushes out traditional views of the family, and it leads to the erosion of religious freedom, which is the next part of what I wanted to say to all of you tonight. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Chariots of Fire. How many of you have seen Chariots of Fire? Okay, some of you, good. Sometimes I ask this question, everyone raises their hand, and then other times people don't, so I never know if I should use it, but I'm glad some of you have seen it. Well, many of you will recall that the runner Eric Liddell, when accused of being impertinent, or he's accused of being impertinent after he refuses to run a race on Sunday, and because of his religious convictions. And he famously responds, "The impertinence lies, sir, with those who seek to influence a man to deny his beliefs." That seeks to influence a man to deny his beliefs. This impertinence is what our founding fathers decided must be avoided at all costs. They recognized that to force a person to deny his beliefs really could not be tolerated, which is the significance of why we have the First Amendment. And why our country was founded on this principle that the freedom of speech and religious liberty are essential freedoms that belong to each and every one of us. And this is a really important concept, because a functioning and thriving society hinges on whether we respect and we tolerate each other's beliefs, regardless of how much we might disagree with those beliefs. Indeed, the very idea of tolerance is actually rooted in the idea that we disagree with one another. And to freely exercise our convictions will actually, in fact, cause us to be at odds with one another sometimes. So this historically is what has made America great, that we can live in a diverse and pluralistic society, and we have the right to disagree and to freely exercise our beliefs. And the government can never force us or compel us to speak or to express any kind of message that we don't want to express. So we have the right to remain silent. We also have the right to freely speak out. I want to give some examples tonight, however, of everyday Americans who have sincerely held beliefs about marriage, and how their beliefs have come into conflict with certain laws that have been enacted recently. But before I do, I want to step back a little bit and set up a framework for you all so you sort of understand what I'm talking about. Right now, more than half of the population, according to the Beckett Fund for Religious Freedom, they did some research and surveys, about half the population of the United States belong to religious communities that have beliefs about marriage and about sexual identity. And so this is about an estimated 160 million Americans. Simultaneously, we now have laws redefining marriage in 12 states. We have, laws that have passed civil unions or domestic partnerships in 9 states. And we also have laws in many states and also in a lot of local communities that have now added sexual orientation and gender identity to the state's non-discrimination laws. So it's not really a surprise that when you have half the U.S. population that has very strong, deeply rooted convictions about what marriage is, when that comes into conflict with some of these new laws, there's obviously going to be some tension. And so the question is, what do we do about it? And the First Amendment says that we should be able to, as Americans, to live our lives according to our beliefs, whether we're at home, whether we're at school, whether we're in church, wherever we might be, whether we're at work. We have the constitutional right to live our lives according to what we believe in. But so far, the people with sincerely held religious beliefs about marriage have been the ones who have been persecuted and been marginalized. And their freedom to live their lives according to their faith is being suppressed because those who advance a new sexual agenda with which they don't agree, they oppose allowing others the right to disagree. And this is incredibly ironic because often the individuals who are behind advocating for a new sexual agenda, advocating to redefine marriage, they're also usually very big proponents of tolerance. So it's ironic that the very people advocating tolerance have become this intolerant of those who disagree with them. They fail to recognize that we cannot maintain a pluralistic society and a robust debate about these issues unless we are all free, not just to speak, but to live out, to exercise our views. So the real question remains, are the champions of tolerance going to truly tolerate everyone's positions? So far, the answer by and large has been no, and I wanted to share a couple examples tonight of fellow Americans who are being given a choice no one should really ever have to face, especially in this country. They're being given a choice between losing their job or following their conscience. And the Supreme Court has said time and time again in its decisions that the First Amendment protects the freedom of the mind, it protects the freedom of religion, and it protects the freedom of speech. You may disagree about marriage, but this is a dangerous precedent to allow people who do support marriage to be persecuted in this way, because this will ultimately silence you perhaps on another issue. So it's always important when we're looking at these issues, we may not agree with a specific person on their point of view, but there might come a time when we want to express another position or live our life according to our belief, and we may not be allowed to do so. So one of our clients that we represent is Elaine Huguenin, and she's a photographer out in New Mexico. And Elaine was approached by a same-sex couple and was asked to photograph her commitment ceremony. She respectfully declined and said, "I'm really sorry, I can't participate in that. I can't use my creative expression to facilitate a message that conflicts with my deeply held religious beliefs." So she referred them to another photographer in the city. They went ahead and found another photographer who was actually less expensive than our client and had their commitment ceremony. Subsequently, however, they came back and they sued our client. And she was hauled before the Commission on Civil Rights. She was fined $7,000, and her case is continually going forward. We litigated her case, or argued her case, before the New Mexico Supreme Court in March, just a few weeks ago. That court came down with its decision and pretty much said that the cost of citizenship is leaving your beliefs at the door, which is fundamentally against what the First Amendment says. So we are taking her case to the U.S. Supreme Court to continue to defend her right to live out her life according to her beliefs. But a couple of points here I want to highlight. First of all, Elaine gladly takes pictures of gays and lesbians. This is not an issue regarding sexual orientation. She happily serves gay and lesbian clients and will photograph them in individual portraits. But what she can't do is use her expressive ability, her photography business, to promote a message that violates her convictions. And the same couple, they found another photographer. They were served, they got what they wanted, and yet they came back and persecuted our client. And this is fundamentally un-American, and it fundamentally violates the uniqueness of our country in which we can engage in this robust dialogue. We have another case that we're currently representing a client. It's a t-shirt company. And this company was asked to print t-shirts for the local gay rights march. And this is a Christian t-shirt company, and they said to the organization, I'm sorry, we really can't print that message, that violates our beliefs. Again, they referred them to a different t-shirt company. but they are also being sued. And this company hires gays and lesbians, so this is not an issue, again, of discrimination based on sexual orientation. This is a desire that they did not want to express a message that violated their beliefs, and they should have the right to be able to do that. Now, some of you might be thinking, I've heard the arguments of, well, we don't agree with their viewpoint. Take Elaine Huguenin. She should have served the same-sex couple. She shouldn't have cared about the message. She shouldn't have the right to do that. Well, it's important then to kind of think about some other fact scenarios. There's other examples of, say you're asked, maybe you really don't like Susan G. Komen. Maybe you think what they do is really bad. So you want to have t-shirts that are going to argue against Susan G. Komen, have them printed. Well, maybe the owner of the t-shirt company has had breast cancer and really likes Susan G. Komen. She shouldn't be forced to print t-shirts with a message with which she fundamentally disagrees. The same thing could be exemplified with a pro-war rally. You might not disagree with that message. You might not want to participate in that message. You may have a gay photographer who's asked to come and take pictures of a pro-marriage event. Well, he shouldn't be forced to take pictures at a pro-marriage event if he doesn't want to. It's America. Another example, you could have a Jewish photographer and a family comes in and wants their whole family picture done. This is a more extreme example, but they have swastikas on their head and their hats, and they all want to reenact something from Germany. Well, that might be really offensive to the Jewish photographer, and he shouldn't be forced to take those family portraits. So these are just some examples to sort of help us think through some various scenarios of how these laws are being applied and what the First Amendment is really all about. Another client that we are currently representing is in the state of Washington. And this case is particularly one that I find really outrageous. This is an older woman who started her own florist company, and she had been friends with this same-sex couple for about 9 years. And she had given them flowers for all sorts of events, birthdays and for their mothers, for Mother's Day. And she had a very close relationship with these two men. Well, Washington recently redefined its laws on marriage and now allows same-sex marriage. So this couple came to her and said, hey, we'd really like you to design all of our bouquets, all of our floral arrangements for our wedding and for our reception. And she had to tell them, look, I've known you all for 9 years. You know how much I care about you and how much I love you. But my religious beliefs my convictions do not allow me to create these floral arrangements for your wedding. I'm going to have to decline. And subsequently, she was sued. So she's actually has several lawsuits against her. And this is an older woman who lives in a trailer park. She's built her business out of nothing. She continues to hire gay and lesbians, which again, my point is, this is not about sexual orientation. It's about redefining marriage. And there are so many Americans who don't want to participate in that message because it violates their moral beliefs, their religious beliefs, and they can't be compelled to violate their conscience in that way by participation. So her case is ongoing. Another area we find religious freedom and free speech in conflict with these new laws expanding the sexual agenda is in the area of counseling. We represented a counselor a few years ago in the state of Georgia, and she was approached by a same-sex couple who were seeking counseling advice. And she said, you know what, I really don't feel like I'm the right person to be giving you counseling advice, because she really didn't believe that same-sex couples should be, together. So she said, let me refer you to my colleague down the hall. So within 10 minutes, the same-sex couple was taken down the hall, and they later, in the form they filled out, they said that they had received exemplary service from this other counselor. So they obviously really enjoyed the counseling session they had with the counselor. Well, they came back and filed a claim against our client, and she was later terminated from her job. She no longer has a job at the counseling center for doing nothing more than saying, I'm sorry, I can't, but I will refer you. This is, again, fundamentally un-American, and it's not tolerant. It's not tolerant of all viewpoints, which is what America is all about. And the take-home point here is this. Individuals and businesses and others, anyone who holds sincere beliefs about human sexuality should never have to face this kind of Hobson's choice, to choose between keeping their business open, keeping themselves employed, and potentially, being forced to violate their conscience. And the reality is, every person's beliefs are protected, and the government can't isolate one viewpoint and decide that it's not going to tolerate that, because this has serious ramifications. If it doesn't like one viewpoint today, well, it might not like another viewpoint tomorrow. So it's important that we protect everyone's positions. So this really brings me full circle to where I was at the very beginning of my talk, in terms of talking about where we are and the fact that marriage and our freedom to talk about it, to live our lives according to that belief, is at a crossroads. And it's really up to each and every one of us to decide whether or not we're going to defend this vital institution. So I want to challenge you tonight to think about what marriage is. I want to challenge you to think about the arguments, think about the impact. You know, all of us have friends who we know who are gay and lesbian. We all have friends who are. But the long-term consequences and the unintended consequences are far bigger than these individual relationships. Because marriage has not only personal, obviously like familial impact, but it has societal impact. And so tonight, I would just ask each and every one of you and challenge you to engage on this issue and to consider stepping forward to defending this institution. So a couple things that you can do to build a solid marriage culture, as well as safeguard other people's rights to speak clearly about it, is learn. Be equipped to speak out about it. We've made that easy for you. There are brochures in the back that have a list of a lot of the questions. I'm sure a lot of you have either asked yourselves or been asked questions like, why are you against equality? The institution of marriage, like I mentioned earlier, is in disarray. What's the harm of allowing same-sex couples to marry? Am I on the wrong side of history? So I would encourage you to pick up one of these brochures and read it and look at it with an open mind and an open heart, because there's a lot of valuable points in there about why marriage matters to our children and to family and to society. So in conclusion, I just want to say in summary that marriage is essential for our country to thrive and to flourish. And I encourage each and every one of you to consider the arguments. Be on the right side of history on this one, so that one day a child won't come and look at you in the eye and ask you, why did you choose that I shouldn't have a mom? Why did you make the choice that I would never get to know my dad? So thank you so much for being here, and I'll let you come up.
All right, thank you both for your words. I'm now going to introduce Trip McCrossan. Trip McCrossan has been a philosophy professor at Rutgers for 2 years, where he's taught on multiple campuses and is a well-loved teacher of many courses in the philosophy department. He will now get to ask both of the speakers questions for about 15-20 minutes, and then we'll have open Q&A time. Please welcome Trip.
I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to be here, and I'll try to direct a couple of general ideas in your direction, not necessarily specific questions, but some things that might help to clarify the conversation. Let me say, before I do that, though, I just want to begin by admitting that on the train here and in recent days since I was invited to be here, I wondered why I was here. I teach ethics at Rutgers, right? So that could be a reason. And yet my syllabus for the class that I teach has not included sexuality and marriage. Since its inception, I've been here for about 10 years and have taught this class. every semester for that long. Hundreds of folks have come through this class. I want to come back to why it's not included in the syllabus, and I want to say it's not because I think that marriage and sexuality are not ethical topics per se, but because I think that there's a reason why they needn't be as controversial, and I think this dovetails with some of the things you've said. They needn't be as controversial as some of the things that are indeed more controversial, or perhaps, I don't want to say more in need of resolution, but perhaps more urgently so. So it can't really be, my syllabus can't really be my class, right? And I was sitting here thinking, why am I here, right? Well, I thought to myself, well, maybe it's because I'm part of the problem. And then I came to think that maybe I'm the problem, right? I mean, I'm a marriage survivor. I've done it several times. The institution seems to be relatively allergic to me. But I am nevertheless hopelessly romantic about the institution itself. I actually agree absolutely that it's a wonderful institution. I'm unsuccessful at it so far. But I think it's a wonderful thing to have as part of society, and indeed an important building block. And for these reasons, I actually think in some ways that, contrary to the suggestions you've made, that it is worth and urgently worth sustaining, but it's worth sustaining in perhaps a more inclusive way. And that's, I think, consistent with the reason, oddly consistent with the reason why sexuality and marriage are not typically part of my syllabus. All right, I want to step back for a second and want to make an observation. In your comments, on a number of occasions, right, the substance of the observation is that there are undesirable, unintended, perhaps even dire consequences to rethinking the institution of marriage, to redefining it. I may disagree with that, although I have to admit that I don't think that I, at this particular moment in time, am actually competent to disagree with it. I actually think that the data per se is not yet entirely available, although there is unquestionably data available to us. From an ethical point of view, however, the thing that I want to point out is that if ethics is something that we want to bring to bear to this issue, we actually have to, I think, be careful about how we talk about it. There is, in the United States, in the modern era, an inclination to think about ethics in terms of consequences. And this is a natural way to think about ethics. What is ethics? What is morality? It's the business of trying to figure out how it is we do more right than wrong. What is right behavior as opposed to wrong behavior? What defines it? How do we pursue one as opposed to the other? And one natural way to think about this is certain behaviors produce certain kinds of consequences. Some are more desirable than others. So why not, as many philosophers have done in history, and as is fairly prevalent in contemporary society, why not simply understand a moral act as one that produces more good consequences than bad, more happiness rather than unhappiness, more utility, as opposed to the opposite? Why not be a consequentialist? Why not be a utilitarian? And I think that there is a kind of consequentialist strain, utilitarian strain, in the way that you're talking. And that's not bad, right, let me say. But I do think it's perhaps incomplete. And so I would venture the following observation, or the following kind of question. Let's say, right, let's say that we accept, for the purposes of argumentation, right, not because I think it's an accepted fact, but for the sake of argument, let's say that there are dire consequences, urgent consequences, let's say, to redefining marriage. Let's say we understand those dire consequences as to be sufficiently dire to prevent us from redefining marriage. And so we, as a society, decide, on the basis of these consequences, to see marriage traditionally defined as between a man and a woman, for all the ostensibly good consequences that come from that and all the possibly negative consequences that come from moving in another direction. I would contend that that would leave out a certain kind of worry, right? It's a standard worry that we walk through in a kind of standard ethics conversation, which is, are there certain issues that trump consequences? A famous turn of phrase by Ronald Dworkin, right? Rights trump consequences. If we move in a direction in which society, because it fears certain consequences, actually keeps a whole portion of the population from enjoying something that the rest of us are happy to enjoy, are we then actually worthy of the happiness that we've come to enjoy as a society? Just as each of us individually have to balance, on the one hand, pursuing good consequences, and there's a natural instinct for us to do so, right? We have to balance the desire for positive consequences for us and for others against the rights that we have. There are certain things that most of us believe we just shouldn't do, or certain things that we should do, even if not doing them or doing them produces more harm than good. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes we can pursue good as opposed to bad consequences fairly easily and simplistically, right? But there are lots of times in which pursuing what we think are good consequences is at the expense of violating other people's rights. So I would ask us to imagine a day, right, sometime in the future, where we worried about the negative consequences of redefining marriage. We found ourselves 10, 20, 25, 30, 40 years in the future having only men and women being able to marry, other people in the population wanting to participate in this institution we value, we, the grand we here, right? And would we not find ourselves perhaps undeserving, unworthy of the happiness that we as a society have come to enjoy? We would be a group that was enjoying all the good consequences as a result of seeming to violate the rights of others. I would contend that here with sexuality and marriage, we need to balance good consequences, or pursuing good consequences with bad consequences, with the rights of the people involved, both ourselves and others. Now, anyone who's been in any class of mine ever, right, knows that that's a very complicated thing to do, and it's a very messy thing to do, right? Well, how do we go about doing that? One of the ways I think that we do that, one of the things that we kind of do in a standard kind of ethics conversation, whether it's about marriage or sexuality or war or terrorism, civil liberties, First Amendment, whatever it may be, right, is to step back and to say, look, we need to be pluralists about this. We need to understand that consequences are important, but rights are important as well. And we need to not go in just one or the other direction, right, which is a question for you guys. I want to hear how you would imagine yourselves not only being moved by a desire to produce more good consequences, but able to balance that against what not only you believe are rights, but the rest of us believe are rights as well. A kind of pluralistic conversation that is inclusive as opposed to exclusive, against the background of respecting, as we all want to do, your ideas about marriage and sexuality, as we would expect you to respect other people's as well. Now, let me just say one other thing for the sake of the conversation. This business of balancing consequences and rights is hugely difficult and hugely messy, and usually doesn't come out with some easy answer, right? Almost never, right? In ethics, in politics, the order of the day is horrible, enduring messiness, right? And we just have to live with that at some level as we try to slog through and make progress, as I believe we have, in recent decades. As a child of the 70s, right? That was the other reason I thought maybe I was part of the problem. But okay, married too many times, child of the 70s. Maybe I'm not really qualified to be here, but let me just say one other thing, which is this business of dealing with messy issues from an ethical, political point of view. It helps us to backtrack and think about the language and the ideas and issues and the concept that we use on a routine basis. One of the ideas that I think is central to ethics is the language of virtue. And I think that language came up in your comments on a couple of occasions, right? Virtues, what are they? Well, virtues can come in different sizes and shapes. We can have athletic virtues, we can have culinary virtues, we can have automotive virtues, academic virtues, all manner of virtues, right? Among the various virtues that recommend us to other people are moral virtues. Moral virtues come in different shapes and sizes. One of the most important virtues is social justice, as Ryan was suggesting, right? What is justice? Justice is at some basic level what we owe one another in terms of non-interference and positive service. Philip of Foot famously defined it in this way, and I think it's a usable and very simple definition. We can write very long books, long complicated books about justice, but at some level, for our purposes, on an everyday basis, justice can be well understood as what we owe one another in terms of non-interference and positive service. What we must do for others, even though what we do may not be good for them. So the classic example from David Hume. One of you is, I borrow money from one of you. Right? The next day you want it back. Right? I know that you're going to use that money for something bad for you. You're going to go off and buy philosophy books or something. Right? Terrible. It's going to just be so bad for you. Right? So I am inclined not to do that out of a kind of compassion. I'm inclined to want to promote the good of your person. Right? But in this case, I have to give the money back because the money's yours at some level. Right? Justice dictates that I am obliged to give that money back even though it's not good for the person in question. Right? A whole range of other virtues that are often ignored in ethics but I think are hugely important, what I sometimes literally refer to as the other virtues: compassion, sympathy, love, kindness, empathy, pity. Right? These are all the ways in which we're virtuous outside of the context of obligation. Decency, for example, is hugely important in the conversation about ethics, right? And has come up in our various legal conversations about certain issues about sexuality, pornography, and such, right? These two concepts, I think, are important to this conversation. Do I believe that we can suffer a liberalization or a redefinition of marriage as a society? I do. Do I believe that we can suffer this even notwithstanding bad consequences? I'm not yet sure what the bad consequences are, but I actually believe that we could probably suffer the bad consequences and survive, right? Do we want to be in a position of respecting what other people insist are their rights? Other things being equal, I think so. What gives me a right as a straight older person, right, to marry? What gives me that right and doesn't give it to my various gay and lesbian friends? It's absolutely unclear what that is, notwithstanding that there may be, I'm not saying there aren't, but there may be bad consequences to doing that. Now, those bad consequences, it seems to me, fall not in the area of justice. It seems to me that justice dictates that we extend rights to others that we ourselves enjoy if they are, for all intents and purposes, the same as we are. And I would suggest that straight and gays and lesbians and other persuasions are all of us more or less human beings. Right? So we should extend rights to them. But if we believe that there are people who are exercising those rights in ways that we don't approve of, if they are exercising their rights indecently, and I would imagine some people of a certain persuasion might look at a gay couple up on an altar being wed as exercising a right that they wish that they didn't have, but they also are having it and they're exercising it indecently. If you witness somebody exercising a right indecently, you can find yourself not only moved, perhaps even obligated to express that indecency, to discourage them from doing this thing that you believe is indecent. But there is a very different quality, it seems to me. It's a very different thing to prevent someone from exercising a right so that they won't exercise it indecently, and allowing them the right while at the same time discouraging them from exercising that right. I believe, going to Kellie's comments about the First Amendment and religious freedom, like the examples you gave are entirely clear-cut. I mean, I can't imagine what basis there would be for prosecuting either ethically or legally the photographer or the florist or whomever, right? Can't imagine, right? Those are questions of rights. We should extend those rights to those people, right? Even if I might feel like they're behaving indecently, which I'm not saying I am, but say I believe they're behaving indecently, say they're in a kind of community, say refusing to take these photographers creates a kind of rumor, say blah, 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 right? I might believe you have the right not to take these pictures, but you're kind of being a schmuck, right? Okay, but that's a different thing, right? But putting the burden on the other side, right, while we should respect those who don't want to participate in various ways in a liberalization or a redefinition of marriage, we should respect that as articulations of political persuasion. It seems like the shoe has to be on the other foot at some point as well. We have to respect people's desire to participate in an institution that the rest of us, straight folks, get to enjoy. There's not one, but among the many things that we abhor in society is hypocrisy. Right? And it does seem to me that it comes dangerously close to hypocrisy to define something as a good for society, perhaps even for humanity, while at the same time not allowing certain people to participate in it. We can discourage them, but it seems to me that's different from not allowing them. So, a difference between consequences and rights, how we balance those is the messy business of literally balancing them, understanding their good and bad consequences, and understanding their rights and responsibilities. And it's difficult to balance these things. How do we do that? We understand virtue as a variously complicated set of dispositions we have that requires us as citizens to balance the hugely important virtue of justice on one hand with, in my opinion, the equally important virtue of compassion, pity, and decency, etc. Those aren't really specific questions, I'm sorry. But perhaps this is a framework that maybe helps this conversation that's about the ethics involved in marriage and sexuality. Perhaps this helps it move forward. Okay? All right.
All right, now it's a chance for all of you to ask questions. If you have any, please come to the aisles here, stand behind the mics, line up. We're just going to go by first come, first served. Yes, yeah, we can do that first. So just addressing briefly those statements like that. So if you guys want, give a signal at the end, and then people can line up after that. I won't come back up after that. You guys just signal, and Ryan, you can go first, and then Keely, I won't come up. But just for the points about people with your questions, when you come up and ask them at the mic, please make sure that they're in the form of a question so that people can get to it, and just, so we can have time to get to as many questions as possible. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for those remarks. I think those are wonderful, and it gives us a lot to work with. I guess my first reaction is that I don't think an argument that discusses consequences is the same thing as a consequentialist argument. So while it's true that Kelly and I discuss consequences in the argument that we make, I think fundamentally the type of argument we're making is one that's from the natural law tradition or from a virtue ethic tradition. And it really centered, if you think about the three key parts of my presentation, it was what is marriage, why does marriage matter, and then what are the consequences of redefining marriage. So it's not clear to me where the proposed right to have the sexual relationship of your choice recognized by the government as a marriage comes from. What ground that right has, if it's founded in nature, if it's founded in convention, if it's just because adults desire it, that therefore it makes it a right. I didn't hear an argument for why there's a right that's being violated, that because there's a group of consenting adults who want a relationship called a marriage and then recognized by other people as a marriage, that therefore makes it a right. It seems to me that if there's a right to marriage, it's a right to have the reality about marriage recognized as such by the state and then not being prevented from forming that type of a relationship. So that would require us right back to the original question of what is marriage? And that you can't smuggle in a right to marriage under the guise of equality or justice or empathy or sympathy or inclusivity or anything like that without answering the question head on, well, what is marriage? Because no matter what, every marriage policy will draw lines. So if the marriage, the inclusive vision of marriage that you have would include the same-sex couple, again, what about the same-sex throuple? What about the opposite-sex quartet? What about the temporary marriage? What about the open marriage? So all of these questions have to be answered, and it seems to me that you can't just claim that there's a right to each and every variety of marriage under the sun, unless you actually want to do roll up your sleeves and do the work of philosophy of thinking about what makes the marital relationship different than others. And it only seems to me that a right to marriage could be violated if a real marriage could be formed and the government refused to either allow you to form that or to recognize that relationship as a marriage. And it seems to me that this is radically different from the case in which we currently have. No one is preventing a same-sex relationship from forming. In all 50 states, two people of the same sex can live with each other and they can love each other. They can go to a house of worship and have a wedding ceremony performed. They can work for a business and get marriage benefits if the house of worship wants to perform a service for them, if the business wants to provide them with benefits. It seems what's at stake here is, will the government redefine marriage and then force other institutions to treat that relationship as if they're married, even when those other people in other institutions don't think that they're married? So I don't see how the purported right here actually works out in reality. And it seems to me that the examples that Kellie gave, Elaine Photography was a case that's been in the New Mexico court system since 2006. So this has been litigated for 7 years. And in August, the Supreme Court of New Mexico ruled against her. And in the concurring opinion, one of the Supreme Court justices in New Mexico said the price of citizenship is that Elaine has to take this picture. So it seems to me that real rights are being violated. In this case, the right of free speech and the right of religious liberty were spurious rights. I'm not sure where the right to have the relationship of your choice called a marriage by the state, or to have private businesses treat your relationship as if it's a marriage comes from. So I guess the only last thing I would say there is that in this case, the way that the objection was phrased, that you wanted to keep certain people out of participating in the marriage institution. It says whether you would allow certain people to participate is the quote that I have written down. And it seems to me that, again, you can't say that unless you know what it is that they're participating in. No one is preventing adults from participating in marriage. The argument here is whether or not a same-sex relationship is a marriage. But even then, we're not preventing same-sex relationships from existing. All that we're suggesting is that precisely because we want the government to be promoting social justice, be promoting the common good, we want the government to be teaching the truth about marriage so that men and women commit to each other, so that children have mothers and fathers. And I don't see how that can be accomplished with the state teaching something that's untrue about marriage.
And I guess I would just add, being a lawyer, I appreciated you bringing up the idea about whether or not rights can trump consequences and bringing that into play, because when the court system looks at any kind of law, there's several different levels of scrutiny. It'll look at a law that the government passes to see if it can maintain a law, or if it needs to be struck down. And so there's what we call rational basis. So the court will look at a certain right. Is a right being violated, or is the law rationally related to an end of the government? Is there a reasonable connection between the two? And then you have fundamental rights, for example. And when the court is looking at any kind of fundamental right that someone has alleged is being threatened, the court will look at whether the law has been narrowly tailored to a compelling government interest in order to uphold that law or not. And so, yes, there are certain ends, there's certain consequences that come. You know, many of us might have a desire to drink at underage, but there's a law in effect because the government saw it was reasonable to limit that desire of ours to drink to a drinking age, so that it avoids the problems that could arise, the government sees that could arise if we allow underage drinking. You could use the example of smoking. So many of us might like to smoke, but the government has said, well, you can't smoke in certain places. You can't smoke in a lot of restaurants now. You can't smoke in or near hospitals, because they saw as reasonable limiting maybe your personal autonomy or your desire to do whatever you want in certain kinds of contexts. There's a lot of laws like this. A lot of laws limit our various freedoms, even our various rights, when there is a good reason to do so. And so in the marriage context, the court looks at it, the government passes marriage laws because it sees marriages between one man and one woman as reasonable, as a reasonable way to reach its end. And the government's end in this case is to ensure kids grow up in, wherever possible, a stable home that lasts, so the government doesn't have to come in and help out, or third parties don't have to be pulled in down the road. That's why they've seen limiting it to one man and one woman as important to reach that desired end. So for what that's worth. But thank you, I really appreciated your thoughts.
I actually have two questions. You guys argued on the basis, you gave the example of Elaine Tuck. She shouldn't have to service someone if she didn't want to, if she didn't agree with their beliefs or values. But not even 60 years ago, we passed, the Supreme Court dealt with a case called Topeka versus BOE, which was about segregation, where people who didn't, let's say someone owned a bar, they didn't have to let people of color into that bar. This is fundamentally the same thing. So I want to know what you say about this being a new Jim Crow or segregation.
Do you want me to answer that first before your next question? Okay, that's a great question. And in the Elaine photography case and other cases that we litigate, that's often a question that the judges will ask. Like, what is the limiting principle here? And the difference is that in the Elaine photography case, she wasn't being asked to serve somebody. She wasn't being asked to serve like a burger or serve someone at a bar, and like I said, she would, as an individual, she would, provide them that service. What she was asked to do in this case, which is different than the case you're talking about and has been distinguished as such, is that Elaine was asked to use her expressive ability. She was asked to create expression to facilitate a message that she disagreed with. And the Supreme Court has held time and time and time again that you cannot force someone, either an individual or a business, to express a message, whether directly or even facilitating a message. You can't force someone to express a message that violates their beliefs. So that's very different than obviously a situation where someone comes in and says, "Hey, I want to serve a burger," and they're like, "No, I'm sorry, we can't serve you," or saying, "You can't drink at my water fountain." Obviously, that's fundamentally unfair and should always be disallowed. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that answers the question.
Okay.
My second question was on the basis of marriage between a man and a woman being advertised for because children need a mother and a father. What about in cases where a heterosexual couple is allowed to marry, but let's say they're over the age of 55, where there probably won't be children? Or in the case of an infertile man and an infertile woman, or vice versa, what makes them different from a gay couple?
Sure. Yeah. I'll answer that, and then I'll also say a word about your prior question. It seems to me that on the account of marriage that we gave in the book and what I gave in the presentation here is that fertility is not a requirement of marriage. What makes a marriage is comprehensive union. So the question is, can a man and a woman unite in this comprehensive way? Can they engage in conjugal actions so that their bodies coordinate and so that they form this comprehensive union, both mind, body, and soul? For example, infertility was never grounds for an annulment, whether it was in canon law or civil law, whereas impotency always was. So with impotency, you can't actually consummate the marriage. You don't actually engage in that conjugal act that unites you in this comprehensive way. But whether fertilization takes place, 10 hours later or 12 hours later, or doesn't take place, doesn't change whether or not the husband and the wife united in that way. And then from the policy perspective, so that's kind of the philosophical answer about what marriage is. I think from the policy perspective, you're still interested in holding up this truth about marriage because it still promotes the marital norm that men and women should be committing to each other permanently and exclusively. And in the cases of infertility that you gave, take the example of the wife's infertile but the husband's not. If the husband remains faithful to that wife, he's not creating fatherless children and fragmented families with other women. It's very infrequent that both parties of the couple will be infertile. So the public policy purpose is still being furthered here by encouraging these two people to be together. The second thing that I would add to your original question is that the one way in which this is different than the lunch counter and the civil rights movement is that skin color, race, ethnicity is completely morally devoid of content. You can't say anything, make any moral evaluation whatsoever on the basis of someone's race. It just doesn't make a difference. Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, they're all the same from a moral perspective. But it's reasonable for someone to make moral evaluation of action. And so the case of marriage is an action. And it's a case of Lane Photography saying that we think this action doesn't constitute a marriage. So it's not discrimination on the basis of status or race or class or something like that. It's making a distinction on the basis of an action. And the reason why I think same-sex relationships are different than interracial relationships, another question that's frequently asked, is that two people can unite in marriage regardless of their race. A man and a woman can unite in a marital sort of way regardless of their skin color. Children need a mom and a dad regardless of their race. But whether or not two people of the same sex can unite in marriage goes exactly to the heart of the question of what marriage is. So this is, again, one reason why I think it's reasonable for the law to protect Lane Photography, making a distinction on the basis of what marriage is, whereas you wouldn't want such discrimination protected if it was on the basis of race.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Hello. On your point of the cases where people started redefining marriage in other fashions, like Dan Savage, as you say, they lay out certain criteria for these new types of marriages. In that, I heard that there are certain restrictions that the policy of marriage has to make so the definitions align to restrict these. Where do you think the line should be drawn between here are the sets that fall in our definition and here are the sets that don't fall in our definition, because your definition for marriage seems to a certain point metaphysical in nature, where it seems, if I could say, religiously metaphysical, where the policy cannot take that into account, that your definition, because of its metaphysics, include things that aren't physical in nature.
Sure. So I assume that the driving force of that question is like a Rawlsian public reason, that you can't appeal to controversial metaphysical doctrines for public policy. My co-authors and I aren't Rawlsians. None of the American founders were Rawlsians. The American regime is based upon metaphysical ideas, the laws of nature and nature's gods, self-evident truths, natural rights. All of these are metaphysical concepts. And there's nothing spooky or improper about appealing to metaphysics in order to do ethics, particularly political morality. It seems to me that you can't have morality untethered from reality, and metaphysics is just the study of reality. So I don't feel the force of the objection.
The main objection was that it's a competitive metaphysics, where there are people that take metaphysics as anything that's naturalistic metaphysics or whatever. And then there's, your definition seems to be, well, if two humans can make a single bond in this sort of way that's more than physical and chemical, therefore it implies such things, and therefore we need to make restrictions so that the government can make policy that takes all of this into account. And this sort of stance on other people's religious freedoms, not only the atheists, not only other religious, within the Christian community, there are religious people that agree with gay marriage.
Sure. So I mean, I think you're pointing to the fact of pluralism. There are lots of different ideas about what marriage is. And I think the task for good public policy is to enact the truth. So if you think my view is false, that would be a reason not to enshrine it in policy and law. But just pointing to the fact that there are competing views, I don't feel that as an objection. There are lots of competing views about what constitutes various sorts of good things or various sorts of bad things. There are metaphysical arguments about what theft is, about what rape is, about what beings have personhood and therefore should be protected against murder. And we don't say that therefore the law can't enshrine those beliefs. People have debates about whether or not unborn human beings are persons. That's a metaphysical debate, and the law will come down one side of that question or the other. I think the unborn child in the womb is a person deserving of the law's protection. Peter Singer thinks the unborn child is not a person. There is no way to be neutral on that question. Either the law will enshrine Peter Singer's view, or it'll enshrine my view, or someone else's view. And I think the same thing is true of marriage. There are competing visions of what marriage is, and the law is going to reflect one of those visions. And I want the law to reflect the true vision.
Both of you present your positions on government involvement in respect to marriage through arguments that assume legal positivism. That is to say, civil laws which are enacted not in reference to natural law, but rather constructed for their potential benefit or utility to society. Is legal positivism intrinsic to your position, or would you be able to translate your argument on such a way as to make it valid even for those who reject legal positivism?
So I'm a little confused because I normally get accused of not being a positivist. The argument I make, I think, is a natural law argument. And so the response to the previous question that I gave was that I think the positive law should reflect the natural law. And that if you think about the American founding, it's all about the laws of nature and nature's God. There are certain truths, self-evident truths, natural rights, and then we enact man-made law to protect those natural rights. I think marriage has an essence by nature, and that the civil law should reflect the truth about marriage that exists independently of anyone's will. The truth about marriage is a natural truth, a metaphysical truth. So I don't think the argument that we've made is one that falls out of legal positivism.
Okay, I wanted to bring up some real-life situations and see what your response is to these real-life situations. Because, as in the case with real-life people in litigation, they make us think more clearly, I think, about what should be and what should not be. Let me start with, and I'll go quickly through these. You said something about no-fault divorce being a degradation of marriage, in a sense. In my own family, there is a person who had to lie to the courts in order to get a divorce, had to claim there was an act of adultery. This was before no-fault divorce came into effect. So he had to lie. The divorce was in the interest of the child because the mother and father could not get along. And for a child to be brought up in a situation where mother and father are fighting, just not interested in each other, it's in the interest of the child that that divorce becomes easier rather than more difficult, and easier to attain rather than to go in court and have to lie. So that's number one situation. Number two is some of the current cases. I think the one before the Supreme Court was brought by a woman who had to pay inheritance taxes because her marriage was not recognized in the same way as a traditional, or in the same way as a same-sex marriage is recognized. And that caused her a hardship. Why should that person not be entitled to the same rights and privileges? One of the things you didn't bring up is the rights and privileges of the couple, which can strengthen the bond, the legal rights and privileges. I don't know, there are 1,000 and so many rights and privileges in the federal laws that can strengthen the bond. How about the rights, and I'm familiar with this, where a same-sex person was not permitted to see a partner in a hospital situation because she couldn't produce a marriage license. That weakens their bond, that weakens the health of the person who needed her partner by her side. So these are a couple of examples. And I think, I absolutely know a couple, and more than one couple, who are not only in an intense emotional relationship, and you seem to define gay marriage as just an intense emotional relationship. No. You don't know them. They're in a committed, lifelong relationship. They want the same legal rights and privileges so they can bring up a child that they both agreed to have. The biological father is in the life of this child. They have 2 children now. One of them was a biological mother, one of the lesbian couple was a biological mother, and the other is also a parent, but the biological father is very much a part of this child's life. So in these real life situations, doesn't that sort of weigh more heavily than in these theoretical definitions of what marriage might be and might not be?
Sure, if you want to first. Okay, so a couple of thoughts on that. I'll start with addressing your first question with no-fault divorce. The majority of scholars who were in favor of divorce laws thought that changes in divorce laws would be good for women and good for children. Then they actually looked at the data and admitted that they were wrong. And this is a rarity in academic life. Normally you get academic change by having old scholars die and then younger scholars come up through the ranks and produce new studies and new arguments. And this was actually interesting that you had scholars who thought that divorce reform would be a good thing and then saw that it actually ended up harming women and children. This isn't to say that divorce law was...
You're talking about statistical, and what does that mean? I brought up an actual case of somebody where no-fault
Right, so if you let me finish,
benefit.
I was going to address your question, but it's hard when you interrupt. So we let you ask your question for a long time. So it's not to say that divorce law was perfect prior to this. It's to say that the divorce reform that we got went too far. That no-fault divorce was not in the service of families, not in the service of children. And that scholars on the left, right, and center, this isn't a particularly conservative point to be making, have agreed that divorce reform would be a good thing. That making the marriage contract more secure, a little bit harder to get out of, so you really only file for divorce for serious reasons. It sounds like the case that you were presenting would be a serious reason. It's not the same thing as just falling out of love or something like that. So no one would want to be in a situation in which you couldn't get out of a problematic marriage. I think most scholars would agree that right now it's too easy to get out of good marriages, and that with a little work and effort, many marriages could be salvaged that currently are being abandoned.
And I can address some of your other questions. These mics are funny. With regard to the Windsor case and the tax that she was forced to pay, one easy fix to that would be to repeal the death tax entirely. Because if you think about it, it really is unfair that if you want to leave your inheritance, say you're living with your sister and you're an elderly couple and you die and you want to leave your inheritance to your sister, you should be able to do that without her facing the same kind of fines that Ms. Windsor was forced to pay. Same thing goes with any kind of relationship. So a solution to that isn't to redefine marriage to include same-sex couples. A simple solution would be to repeal the death tax and fix that particular policy provision to ensure that anyone can leave their inheritance to someone else without facing substantial fines. Similarly, on a sort of a similar note with the hospital visitation, again, you don't need to redefine marriage to include same-sex couples to allow for them to have hospital visitation. In most states, in most places, they're allowed to see their partners. You hear that argument brought up a lot, but there's very few times when they actually aren't prevented from seeing their partners. And even in situations where they were, it's very easily fixed by enacting other kinds of solutions, even in the law, that don't necessitate redefining marriage. You can give them that particular benefit that if you go to the hospital, you should be able to see your loved one, whether that's your young sister who has Down syndrome and needs someone to care for her, whether that's your same-sex partner, whoever it is, you should be able to see them and visit them in the hospital, and that should be addressed as a particular scenario. And then I think the last point you brought up was the same-sex couple who not only is in an emotionally engaged relationship, but they're committed to each other. They want to be with each other for life. And the law allows them to do that. But to redefine marriage to allow them to get married and to present as an ideal, allowing two moms to raise a child in that kind of environment where this is a totally normal for you to have two moms, that's problematic to that child's development, to know that they don't have, yes, they might be able to see their biological father, but it's not promoting the ideal of marriage, which is to bring one man and one woman together, because those two women obviously cannot have children. They either have to adopt or go outside their relationship. And marriage is all about keeping children within the two, with the two people who created that child. That's why the government supports marriage.
Well, I think it's problematic if we make it problematic.
I would just point to competing stories. In the introduction, it was mentioned that I edit a journal called Public Discourse, and two articles in particular that we published in the past year were by people in the LGBT community who don't favor redefining marriage. The first was titled, Growing Up with Two Moms, The Untold Child Story. And this was authored by Bobby Lopez. He grew up raised by his mother and her lesbian partner, and he loves his mother, he loves her lesbian partner, but he says he really would have wished to have grown up with a father, and that he's not in favor of redefining marriage because he doesn't see how that policy would send the message that dads are really important. And he just goes through, you can look this up, if you just Google Growing Up with Two Moms, The Untold Child Story, he just tells his story of what it was like being raised by two mothers. And then he mentions how hard it was for him to find someone willing to publish his story. That the mainstream media likes to present it as if everyone in the LGBT community speaks with one voice on this question. In the same way that the media wants to present it as if all women speak with one voice on abortion, the voice of Nancy Pelosi, they want to make it seem like Andrew Sullivan speaks for all LGBT Americans. The other article that I was fortunate to publish was by Doug Mainwaring, titled I'm Gay and I'm Against Gay Marriage. It's another really good article to read. He tells a story that he was married to his wife. He discovered that he had same-sex attractions, or he finally admitted to himself that he had same-sex attractions, so he left that relationship, was raising his two children, and then he really realized that his boys needed a mother, and that he and a same-sex partner, they could be the best fathers in the world, but they couldn't be a mother to his children. And so he got back together with his wife just to form a family structure that would be best in the interest of his two children. And he's now doing full-time work actually educating and, on the marriage issue because of his own life experience. So I would want to take the stories that you've shared with us, which I believe, and I think they're true, and put them in the conversation with some other stories, personal stories about the definition of marriage and why it matters, because I think those are the voices that frequently get silenced in the current discussion.
Yes.
So I just have one question. So throughout your talk, you kept saying that a child needs a mom and a dad, but I don't think you gave like a strong reason. Like, is there a strong reason as to why a child must have a mother and a father versus like two fathers?
Sure. I cited the quotation from President Obama that ran through some of the statistics about children who grow up without a father in terms of crime and dropping out of school and prison and out of wedlock childbearing and things like that. And I could cite some other things if you wanted to look at the social science and compared children who were raised by their married biological mother and father to children raised in alternative households, whether it was single parenting, divorce and remarriage, cohabitation, and some same-sex relationships. We have 2 studies right now that use large, random, representative samples to look at children who were raised by same-sex couples. And the conclusion from all of these studies, and we now have about 30 or 40 years of rigorous social science that compares family structure, intact biological married mother and father, to single parenting, to divorce and remarriage and cohabitation, and we're just starting to get the studies on same-sex parenting. And they all report the same thing, that children who are raised by their biological married mother and father turn out significantly better on a host of indices. This isn't to say that children who are raised in alternative family structures are doomed for failure or somehow going to be destined to bad outcomes, but it is to say that there's a statistically significant correlation, and many are arguing causation, and they argue causation for 3 reasons. They say 3 factors really matter for parenting: biology, sex, and stability. And so I'll say just a word about each of those. Biology matters in that having a biological connection with the child seems to produce better outcomes for that child. They're not clear about all the vectors in which this works, but they just think that there are certain ways in which just sharing kind of a genome with that child gives you a leg up. Mothers can hear the cry of their infant and identify it better than the cry of other children. Girls have a delayed puberty when they're raised by their biological father compared to an unrelated male. So there's something about biology, whether it's the pheromones that are being sent, that the father sends or that other men sends, that impacts a girl's onset of puberty. Then sex matters in that men and women parent in different ways. The quote that I read from the sociologist here, David Popenoe, shows that there's no such thing as parenting. He says there's mothering and there's fathering, and they interact in different ways. An example that Brad Wilcox, a sociologist at the University of Virginia, uses is that which parent's most likely on a Saturday morning to be wrestling on the living room floor with a 5-year-old boy, teaching the boy to be aggressive but not to be violent, to be masculine but not to pull hair, gouge eyes, bite. It could be the mother, but on average and for the most part, that's something that dads do. And this is one of the causal vectors in which absentee fathers is correlated with an increase in crime with boys, because it's frequently the father that's helping the young boy develop traits to control his aggression while being masculine, to not get violent but still kind of stand up for himself, those sorts of things. And that mothers do corresponding things for their children. Fathers are also the ones that typically scare away bad boyfriends. It's not that mothers can't do this, but on average and for the most part, it's the father that makes sure his daughter's not dating the wrong sorts of guys, and this is one reason why there's a correlation between absentee dads and teen pregnancy for girls. And then the last thing is stability matters. Every transition that a child has to go through is correlated with poor outcomes. So cohabitation is correlated with poor outcomes, divorce, poor outcomes. And you could see why. So a relationship where the example that was given earlier was you had the lesbian couple, but the biological father was also involved. That's going to tend to be an unstable relationship. One thing that we do know about same-sex relationships is that they're statistically significantly less stable than unions of men and women, and it doesn't have so much to do with homosexuality as it much to do with sex itself. So a union of 2 women tends to be the shortest lived of all 3 types of relationships. You can have 2 women, 2 men, and a man and a woman. The union of 2 women is the shortest lived of all, and it seems to be because women have a very high demand for emotional satisfaction. About 2/3 of all divorces are initiated by women because women tend to have a greater need for emotional intimacy. Guys kind of shrug it off. It's like, it's good enough, that sort of thing. So when you have a double female relationship, they tend to be shorter lived because it's harder to meet that threshold. A double male relationship, on the other hand, tends to be more sexually active or promiscuous or sexually open. So again, it's not because of homosexuality per se, it's just double female, double male. When you get the one of each, you tend to have a greater chance for that stability. So that's one reason why the social scientists will say that the outcomes, there's a vector through which marriage does this, is that it connects the biology, the sexual difference between a man and a woman, and the stability all in one institution, and that this therefore produces those outcomes for children that we want to see.
I mean, there are some studies that say there's no significant difference between like same-sex coupled raised children versus.
Yes, so there are some studies. None of them have used large, random, or representative samples. The studies that we have on same-sex parenting that show that lesbians actually do a better job than married moms and dads use small snowball samples, which more or less compound bias and error on top of each other. The way that they would conduct these samples would be by putting up flyers in gay and lesbian bookstores and coffee shops saying, we're conducting a study on same-sex parenting, call this number. And then so that way the respondents to the study knew what was being studied, and so then it built the error on top of each other because it wasn't a blind sample, nor was it large and representative. The average respondent for many of those studies was a double-income, upper-middle-class white woman relationship living in Manhattan or California. So it wasn't representative of the population as a large, and you can't really draw any conclusions of a population at a large from a sample that's not representative. But the studies that we do have that use representative random samples do produce consistent results.
Okay.
Okay, so it seems to me that a really central tenet of your argument is that a child is best and will fit best into society and is healthiest innately if they're raised by a single man and a single woman, which sounds plausible, but there are a number of cultures that do things differently. There's kibbutz in Israel where children are raised communally. There's a society where brothers all marry the same woman and they all raise the children together. And those kids turn out fine. And those systems have been continued through the society for centuries. So I guess my question is, when we say that children in our society who are raised by a single man and a single woman are better off, is how do we know that that is not because of the prejudices that our own society puts against children from non-traditional, non-Christian families?
Sure. So it could be the case that it's based on like a social stigma against children who are raised by single mothers or single fathers or something like that. But the social scientists try to control for that as much as possible. And in the answer to the previous question, the vectors, the causal factors that they identified had to do both with biology, with sexual difference between mothering and fathering, and then with stability. There could also be an aspect of stigma involved, although I think single parenting today is significantly less stigmatized than it was a generation or two ago. So we would have seen that factor die off over time. It's not as if children on playgrounds today who are raised outside of wedlock are being harassed by their classmates, because the majority of them on many playgrounds are raised outside of a biological married mother-father family. So we wouldn't expect that to be the cause. I think it's more to do with just the limitations of being a single parent, the limitation of not having gender complementarity with a mother and a father, the limitations of not having the biological connection, the limitation of not having the stability. Which suggests it's not so much a matter of stigmatization as much as it is about the nature of the parenting enterprise.
Sorry, it's hard to form a question properly while trying to pay attention to your responses.
I understand.
Okay. But basically, I'm a little confused about how the it seems inconsistent to me to say that marriage is totally for the ideal raising of children, but particularly the biological children. And sure, if those if that is the ideal, why does that not create any other kinds of consequences for like adopted parents, whether whether that adopted child is raised by a man and a woman or a same-sex couple, isn't it better for them to have the opportunity to be raised in a loving family as opposed to in an orphanage? And as well as I'm just going to end it there unless I can get that last part out.
So your question is, I think if I understand you, so tell me if I'm getting it wrong. But you're asking, is there a difference between a same-sex couple adopting a child versus an opposite-sex couple adopting the child because there's no biological connection? Is that your question?
Yeah, that's part. Like, there's no biological. There's no. What exactly is that difference, and why does that? Like it seemed to me like that the necessity of raising a child is really brought into the whole question of what is marriage, when there are married people who do not have children. It's if marriage is to encourage this ideal union, why does that not affect marriages which do not fit this model? Particularly, like there are heterosexual marriages which do not fit this model as you propose because of adoption, and there are as well as the homosexual.
No, I think I understand. I'll say a couple things. One, marriage, you're right. There are some marriages, some couples choose not to have children. They cannot have children. There might be various factors where they would never have children or even adopt children. But the fact that they still are married and show that they have that complementarity, they still live out the ideal that they've engaged upon, which is the complementarity of the sexes. So just being married, even though they don't have children, it still adheres to what marriage is, which is the union of a man and a woman. So Mariana talked about this earlier, but they may not have kids or they may adopt kids, but they still uphold that ideal of being a man and a woman. So that if they ever did, or if they ever did adopt children, that child would be brought into a situation where they would have both a male and a female role model. Does that address your question? Because I think you also brought up adoption, right? And would it be better to let a child just, stay in foster care versus there might be an opportunity for that child to have a loving home? And I think the reality there is, everyone is capable, or most people are capable of loving a child, right? But the question is, are they going to be able to provide that child with both a male and a female role? And I think at least in the foster care system, there are so many couples eager to adopt a child, to give them a mom and dad, that's not necessarily a problem. There's also a lot of single men and women who are eager to adopt children, where at least they may not have both a mom and dad, but they wouldn't have held to them growing up of having two moms or two dads and the confusion there.
Let me add one thing to that, sure. I would say that it's true not every marriage will produce a child, but every child deserves a mother and a father. And so that's what marriage policy does. Marriage policy is based on the rule, not the exception to the rule. And so while it's true that there are a small percentage of marriages that end up not producing children, that does nothing to take away from the public purpose and public message of what marriage is, which is to unite every child with a mom and a dad. The question of adoption is interesting because we see even at adoption, with adoption at childbirth, there seem to be additional hurdles present there that aren't the case with children born into families. So we see even with adoption at childbirth, the outcomes for children tend to be just slightly less than what they are for children raised by their biological mothers and fathers.
Sorry,
and that seems to
could
be...
you repeat that? I didn't...
What's that?
I didn't hear that last thing.
It seems to be the case that even with children who are adopted at childbirth, so there's no transition and there's sexual complementarity, this is one of the pieces of evidence that social science will point to, that biology matters. So there's not that biological connection. And that even though they were adopted right at childbirth, just that alone suggests that there's something about biology that matters, which might lead to a thought experiment. Would you want to have a situation in which children were just randomly assigned to parents? You go into the hospital pregnant, and then they just dish out the babies randomly. Most people would say no. Like, most people want to take home, it matters which baby they take home from the neonatal ward after they give birth. They want to take home their baby. That biological connection matters. And a lot of children, it matters to them as well. You know, they would prefer to be raised by their biological mother or father, and they frequently want to find out their biological origins. So this is just to highlight, I think sometimes we downplay the importance of biology, but it does seem to matter, and this is why parents who get sent home from the hospital with the wrong baby kind of care about this. That biological connection matters to the parents and to the child. The question of whether or not a child would be better with a same-sex couple than with no family, I think, is an easy one to answer. Of course. Of course a child would be better with a same-sex couple than being abandoned. But I don't think that's the situation at hand. I mean, the question really is, what do we owe as a matter of justice to that orphan? And I think what we owe as a matter of justice to that orphan is to do everything we can to find that child a mother and father to raise the child. That something has gone wrong in the first place, that the child finds him or herself in need of adoption. That's not the natural situation. Something went wrong, they need to be adopted, and we should do everything within our power to do right by that child, which to my mind would suggest finding that child both a mom and a dad. But in all 50 states, same-sex couples are free to adopt. You know, there are no laws against this, but I do think policy should really emphasize and promote that children would be adopted by moms and dads.
Thanks, guys, for being here tonight. My question originally, as I was thinking, is if we deny same-sex couples the right to marry, do we encourage them to live a life of promiscuity as opposed to in a committed relationship? And I think that as I was thinking about it, the response is really, well, that's why we have civil unions. New Jersey recognizes civil unions, as do a number of states. But how do you respond to those that think that a civil union relegates same-sex couples to being second-class citizens, that they will never be eligible for the rights and privileges that attach to marriage, and how do you respond to the second-class citizen argument?
Sure. I think the question here is, I think the same question would apply for the civil union as it would apply to marriage. What lines are you going to draw and why? So do we relegate the 500,000 polyamorous households in America to a third-class status by not recognizing their relationships at all? 2009 article in Newsweek reported that there are 500,000 of these polyamorous households. A throuple is one example of a polyamorous household. And it just seems to me that you can't have like an infinite variety of marital sort of contracts. And so, to my mind, the reason that we don't recognize non-marital relationships as marriages is that it ends up weakening the importance of what marriage is and why it matters. So I'm personally not in favor of civil unions. I think all citizens should be free to live and to love how they want to, enter into a variety of contractual relationships, but I don't see what the limiting principle would be for civil unions. If you provide a civil union for the same-sex couple, will you provide a civil union for the same-sex throuple? And it just seems to me that the same kind of reductio would apply here, that there would be an endless series of claims of injustices being committed against alternative forms of structuring adult life. To your prior question about, by not having same-sex marriage or same-sex civil unions, are you encouraging promiscuity? I don't think so, because again, I don't think that marital norms make sense just by issuing a piece of paper apart from the conceptual underpinnings. So it's not as if the marriage license is what reinforces monogamy and sexual exclusivity and permanency. To my mind, it's something about the relationship in and of itself that does that, and the logic of the relationship. And I don't see what logic of a same-sex relationship would demand those sorts of norms. They could be chosen when desired, so you could choose to live out monogamy, exclusivity, and permanency, but I don't see what about that relationship in and of itself would require it.
And I would just add, you mentioned the language of they've been relegated as second-class citizens, and this was language that Kennedy used in his Windsor decision, right? But the reality is that anyone is free to enter into a marriage. That's no one's saying you can't get married. They're just saying there's a requirement that you marry someone of the opposite sex. So the argument that you're not being allowed and that somehow you're a lesser class citizen is really not entirely accurate, because everyone is given the equal opportunity to enter into marriage, but they're asked to marry someone who is of the opposite sex. So that's another lens through which to kind of come to an understanding of the issue.
Hi, Ryan and Kellie. Thank you very much for coming and sharing your ideas. In full disclosure, I'm a part-time lecturer here at Rutgers, but also a graduate from too many years ago. So thank you very much for coming and sharing these ideas. One thing I'm still trying to grapple with, and I know you've addressed it in many different ways with very well-presented arguments, is the commitment that the United States has to try to provide equal protection to those in this country. And I think it, to use an analogy, I think it's painted itself into a corner where for many, many decades, many centuries, it's tried to promote the institution of marriage with favorable policies for those who entered into this contract. And now they are competing with challenges to the definition of marriage and to, in a more pluralistic environment, trying to include more people within that grasp. And I'm still trying to reconcile myself, what is the practical policy solution that you come up with? Because these real-life situations are very complicated. You have men who've been in prior heterosexual relationships who've had children, who then, as you were giving the example, Ryan, find themselves in a different circumstance and in the position where they might want to remarry, where they have existing biological children. These are very complicated solutions. This is my long-winded approach to asking you the question. I know that societally, we have receded, or heterosexuals have receded the institution of marriage through a more liberal approach to sexuality. Has there been anything that in your studies that has come across where you found that government policies have not been either strengthened or have receded over the course of that same half-century that have led to a disinterest in the effectiveness of marriage?
So if I understood the question right, it's have there been effective government policies that have kind of prevented the erosion of marriage, something like that? I think the campaign to prevent teen pregnancy has been remarkably successful. The teen pregnancy rate is significantly down from where it was prior to this campaign. And I think this campaign was largely a 1990s phenomenon, but yet all sorts of public information commercials and things like this just sending the message of it's not a good idea to get pregnant when you're a teenager. And now they're trying to advance that into the early 20s and to say a campaign against non-marital childbearing. Right now, it's not so. It's interesting that if you look at some of the statistics on child rearing and childbearing, it's not so much that people are accidentally getting pregnant, and that's how you have out-of-wedlock childbirths. But you have women who at a certain point of time choose to become mothers because they've given up on the possibility of finding a husband. In certain communities, it's very hard to find a marriageable male, and they say, I want to have a meaningful relationship, I want to have a child, I'm now 22, 23, 24, wherever, I'm wanting to have that kid. And so it's a question for me of what would a public education campaign look like that would encourage marriage and would encourage marital childbearing. But we have at least been successful at delaying it until after high school. The campaign to prevent teen pregnancy has actually delayed the onset of childbearing, but we haven't been as successful in promoting marital childbearing.
I say this all because there's this kind of irony where you have heterosexual people who are avoiding the institution of marriage. You have homosexual couples that want to pursue it. And some of the arguments that are being advanced is that there are financial, legal benefits to the institution of marriage that don't seem to be a strong enough incentive in some cases, and are the argument for the extension of that benefit to others. So thank you.
Yeah.
All right, please join me in thanking our speakers for tackling this very controversial topic. All right, so if you had a chance to fill out the cards on your seat, you can go take them by the table to maybe get that book raffle, and also with your questions on the bulletin. And thank you all for coming out, and for those of you online and for watching, thank you, and everyone have a good night.